Okay, so we're going to be talking about the idea of genetics. Of course, everybody knows that genetics is how you get to look the way you do, how you have certain traits in common with your mother and different traits in common with your father. Um, some of the ideas that were floating around before we figured it all out was that maybe there was blending, kind of a if your mom was blue and your dad was yellow, then you might be green. Um, if your mom was black and your dad was white, then you might be gray. That is one possible idea, but probably isn't true. Um, Something that we're more now believing is the actual case in most situations, 90% of situations, is more of a kind of a particulate hypothesis where there's a discrete heritable unit that you inherit. Those things that we now call genes, stretches of DNA that code for proteins. This hypothesis of genes can explain why you would have something pop back up a couple of generations later that wasn't visible in either of the parents. So it might have been visible in a great grandparent, and it was just obscured for a long time and then popped back up. So we're going to talk about that. The major person that is responsible for figuring this out was somebody named Gregor Mendel, and he did it because his boss, Abbot Knapp, was a goat breeder and was trying to figure out why he could breed a black goat with a black goat and still get white babies. And so he gave it to Mendel. Mendel had a background in mathematics and also had studied to be a doctor. And so this was right up his alley. Mendel decided to use garden peas to figure it out. They have a much shorter breeding time than goats, easier to control the experiment. He picked peas because they had different characters. So character could be something like how tall the plant is or what color the flower is. And it came in distinct traits or variants of that character. So like tall versus short, or purple versus white. But he also picked it because he knew how to control the mating. He knew which portions of the flower were responsible for the male gametes and which were responsible for the female gametes. So he could cut off the stamen, the part that's responsible for the male gametes, and then manually move the male gametes or the pollen to the egg-producing organ called the carpel, or he could put it on the pistil so that it would be delivered to the carpel, and so he could control cross-pollination, moving the pollen from one flower to the other. So he would do this by cutting off all of the stamens and putting them aside, and then only transferring from the one that he wanted to be the father to the one that he wanted to be the mother. And then that way, the one that was going to be the mother would be a cross. And so here, crossing a purple flower and a white flower would give a bunch of babies, the peas, and then when he planted those peas, he would get the children generation, and those would be purple. And so we call the original purple and the original white flowers, we call those the P generation, P for parental. And we call these children, we call those the F1 generation, or the first filial generation. He was using what he called true breeding, which was if he had a purple flower plant that when self-pollinating gave only purple offspring, he called that a true breeder. A white flowered plant gave only white offspring, so he called that a true breeder. This would be in contrast with if he had a purple plant and he crossed it against itself, so he let it self-fertilize, self-pollinate, and he got some white. If he got some white, then it wasn't a true breeder and he didn't use it for his experiments. Today we call this homozygous. Instead of true breeder, we call it homozygous, and I'll talk about that later. Okay, so mixing a purple with a white is called a hybridization. Hybrids are the babies. Two true breeding varieties of contrasting traits, the P generation or parental generation would generate the first filial generation of hybrids. And then he also allowed those F1s, the first filial generation, the hybrids, to self-pollinate or cross-pollinate to yield the F2 or second filial generation. So when Mendel crossed the true breeding white with the true breeding purple, all of the F1 hybrids were purple. What this said was that somehow the purple had obscured the white. It had covered it up. But in the second filial generation, or the F2s, when he allowed them to self-pollinate, he discovered that he would get a 3-to-1 ratio, 3 purple flowers for every 1 white flower. So if he got 750 purples, he would get 250 whites. And so he had the parental generation was true breeding purple crossed with true breeding white, and the F1 generation was all purple. But when he allowed those to self-pollinate, he got a 3-to-1 purple to white ratio. And it really didn't matter what he tested, flower color or other traits, he kept seeing this same pattern. And to a mathematician, this was something that couldn't be, just random. It had to have a reason. So he said that the purple was dominant and the white was recessive. And the fact that he would get white flowers in the F2 meant that the white was still there but had been covered up and was allowed to reappear in the F2 generation. And so this kind of crushed the blending idea and said it was more a particulate explanation. So he didn't do this with just the flower color. He did this with other plant characters where he had 2 traits that he could test. He called these heritable factors, but they are now what we call genes. So he tried flower color, flower position, pea color, pea shape, pod color, plant height. And in every case, he kept getting a 3-to-1 ratio, a 3-to-1 ratio. And so being a mathematician, he knew that this 3-to-1 in the F2 generation had to have an explanation. That he used 4 related concepts to create a model that would explain this. And these concepts are perfectly explained by what we now know about chromosome behavior from back in the meiosis, mitosis chapters. Okay, so his concepts. 1, that alternative versions of genes account for the variation in inherited characters. So these genes, we now know, exist on a chromosome. He didn't know what it was because he didn't even know the DNA was what caused inheritance. But we now call these different versions alleles, and we call the place on the chromosome where they exist, we call that the locus. So we've got a locus for flower color on different chromosomes, and that locus contains the gene for flower color, can have different alleles. One allele is for purple, and a different allele is for white. And so this, he thought, was probably true for all of the different traits, that there was some particulate that we now call the gene that was causing the patterns that he saw. The second related concept was that for each character, an organism inherits 2 alleles, one from each parent. He didn't know anything about chromosomes, but he thought that each parent gave a particle for color, whatever that was. And we now know that it's the gene on the chromosome. So the true breeding plants had 2 identical chromosomes. We now call that homozygous. And when the hybrids had 2 differing alleles, then one could be obscured by the other. The dominant covered up the recessive. The third was that one of them could be dominant over the other. And so he called the one that was seen in the F1 generation, he called that the dominant allele, and the one that was obscured, he called that the recessive allele. So the F1 plants are purple, not because both of the alleles are purple. One could be purple and the other white, or both are purple. Either way, the plant will be purple. So the fourth concept is that what we now call the law of segregation, is that the 2 alleles are inherited at random. So for each heritable character, they segregate at random in different gametes. So an egg or a sperm gets only one of the 2 that the parent had. Doesn't get both, just gets one. So it could be either version that the parent had. And so we can figure out the pattern of inheritance using a Punnett square. I will talk about Punnett squares in the next video.